Good morning. Welcome to Life Point Church. My name's Mike Andrews. It's always a joy when I get to be here with you. I don't know how I'm going to follow that, to be completely honest with you. I'm so thankful for Josh's leadership and his testimony, but I kind of wish he would have said spoiler alert, because that was basically all I was going to talk about. So I guess we can just go home. Does that sound good? No, I'm kidding. We are going to talk about suffering today, in case you couldn't figure it out from that tune. And I know there's not going to be a lot of cheerful thoughts on that, and that you're not going to be really, really pumped for the next 30 minutes or so. But, that's what you get when Adam gives me free reign over a sermon topic. And it's funny, he was really encouraging, though, because when I told him I was thinking about talking about suffering, he said, Mike, I think that after listening to you for 30 minutes, our church is really going to understand suffering. And I was just so humbled that he would trust me with that. Did I maybe hear that wrong? I'm kidding, of course. But the funny thing is, you can hear him saying something like that. But as I considered what I was going to talk about today, I couldn't shake the idea that Christmas time is incredibly joyful, but yet there's sort of this undercurrent of sorrow to it all. The holidays might magnify the absence of a loved one or a strained or difficult relationship, loneliness, this general sense that life isn't the way it's supposed to be. The list could go on and on and on. I'm certain there are a number of us in here today who we may have enjoyed the Christmas season, the carols, the nativity story, other traditions that we're ready to pack everything away in mothballs until next year. Maybe we already have. It's not because we're Scrooges who say, bah humbug to everything. It's just because the holidays are hard and they can hurt. So as the year winds down and as we start to take stock of 2018, there's that opportunity for things that have happened to us over the past 360 days to be brought back to our mind and maybe to open up some wounds. It's a hard time of year. Now, full disclosure, the idea for this topic today was born from personal experience. I don't want to sound like a martyr or anything, but our family has had what seems like more than our fair share of difficult moments in 2018. And even if I wanted to, it wouldn't be time efficient to list them all. But if I did, I'm sure that some of them wouldn't seem that bad. Some of them would be very relatable, and others you'd probably say, yeah, that's rough. It was everything from unexpected financial expenditures to medical emergencies to loss of pets to suffering friends to difficult relationships to scary medical diagnoses for family members. I mean, to be clear, in spite of all that, there was a lot of joy, and we saw God be very, very faithful to us, but we are so over 2018. It was just this seemingly endless string of events that highlighted the various ways that suffering infiltrates our daily lives. I feel confident in saying that you all have your own lists, and some of them are probably longer and contain things that are more tragic than my own. When seasons like this hit, when the weight of life is crushing us, it is so difficult to survive, let alone thrive. In such seasons, it seems like the most we can manage to do is cry out, as David did in Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord?" Now, generally, I think suffering can be observed in two major categories. First, there are trials and difficulties that last for a season, however long that may be, and ultimately they're resolved. But then those are those other categories where the suffering is ongoing and it's not restored this side of heaven. See, suffering is complex, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And not only are the situations different, but the people involved in them are different. They respond differently based on their individual situations and their individual personalities. It's precisely because of this, though, that I think the Bible and the Christian faith can offer such a salve for weary souls by showing that God is at work in us during such times. Today we're going to bounce around the Bible a bit to discuss some of the general principles about suffering that I think will be helpful for us to remember or maybe to hear for the first time. My prayer this week for all of you has been that if you're overcome with grief and suffering today, that you'd find encouragement and comfort in this message. If you're not, I hope this equips you when trials come your way, because the reality of life, unfortunately, is that every single person in this room right now is just a phone call away from being launched into a season of suffering. To begin, let's quickly do an overview of categories of suffering that we see in the Bible. The first is pretty easy to understand. It's suffering that we bring on ourselves. It's a result of our sin. We see this reflected in figures like Jonah and David. Jonah ran away from what God called him to do, and he had to endure a storm that resulted in him being swallowed by a fish for his disobedience. David committed adultery and murder and faced the consequences of those sins. While suffering under these circumstances isn't any easier, we can at least rationally get our mind around it because there's a cause and effect nature to them. But of course, as Christians, we know that not all suffering is because of bad behavior. We might suffer because of our good behavior. A biblical example of this is the Apostle Paul. If you look at 2 Corinthians 11, he highlights a list of everything that he's endured. He was imprisoned, flogged, left to die of exposure, beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked, in danger everywhere he went and from everyone he met, homeless, shipless, foodless, naked, and thirsty. In short, serving the Lord well is no guarantee your life will be free from suffering. The opposite is often true. And while we don't face outright persecution for our beliefs like Paul did or like some of our brothers and sisters around the world do, it's becoming increasingly clear that professing our convictions could cost us relationships, jobs, etc. Now, in some respects, we don't need to look at Paul's life to know that it's not true that only bad people suffer and good people never do, because we live in a fallen world. And because of that, we will all experience the universal suffering of death. No advances in modern technology or medicine have changed the mortality rate. It remains 100%, and it is independent of behavior, good or bad altogether. The grief of loss is crushing, and yet it's something that we all have to deal with. And maybe the most difficult suffering of all is the kind that doesn't neatly fit into any of the categories I've already mentioned. It's Job-type affliction that's not for any easily identifiable reason. It's impossible to make sense of because from our vantage point, it is utterly senseless without rhyme or reason. Now, to be sure, those are four pretty broad categories, and it wouldn't be difficult to name some multiple subcategories of each type of suffering or to mention that oftentimes it can fall into multiple categories at once. So in the interest of time, I'll simply sum up my point by saying the Bible's pretty clear. No one escapes suffering. So who's good and depressed this morning? Well, here's some good news. Romans 8:28. For those who love God, all things work together for good. I want to wield that verse carefully because if I don't, it might come across as if I'm just giving you some empty platitude. The last thing I want is to sound like I'm saying that if you don't believe that you're a bad person or something like that. No, what I think this verse does to us and why it speaks to us in our pain is that though suffering may seem senseless, it's never pointless. God can and does work for his glory and our good, even in the most hopeless of situations. To examine this idea more closely, let's look at 1 Peter 1:3-9 together. If you need a moment to find it in a book Bible, it's near the end of the New Testament. Side note, this was a Christmas gift to myself. I was told it was an actual replica of the Bible Jesus used, which is pretty cool. I don't have to explain that joke, do I? Everybody knows Jesus used King James Version. Oh, wow, we've got a slow crowd this morning. Oh, well, anyway, if you don't have a book Bible, you can thumb there on your electronic device, or it'll be up on the screen as well. This is going to be our outline for this morning, but like I said, we'll bounce around. You can feel free to keep yourself parked here, though. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible, filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Peter says in these verses that suffering and our faith are connected. The first way is that suffering flexes our faith. Let me tease out this metaphor of flexing a little bit. I don't mean for this to be a word picture of a bodybuilder that's showing off a perfect physique in a competition. The idea is more of the bodybuilder has to flex his or her muscles through the strain of exertion and training to produce the physique. Flexing isn't showing off the finished result, it's the process that leads to the result. In a spiritual sense, we don't show off our faith in suffering. It's that we are building our faith through it. Peter writes in verse 6, "In this you rejoice, though you have been grieved by various trials." He goes to say that these trials are the training ground where we test the genuineness of our faith. We see the same idea in Hebrews 12:11, which says, "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." And a quick Greek lesson that I learned in preparing for today is the word that the writer of Hebrews used there is gymnazo. It's the same root word from which we get gymnasium in English. Now, athletes enter a gymnasium to work toward their peak potential, to their peak ability, skill, and endurance, and that only comes through constant, rigorous training. They have to exhaust the strength that they do have in order to get stronger. If they aren't regularly challenging and testing their muscles, they're going to lose some of the strength that they previously built. So spiritually speaking, we consider the testing or trials that Peter writes about as time that we spend in God's gymnasium. It's here that our faith can become more genuine, to use his word. Now, those of us who made New Year's resolutions to exercise more probably are motivated in some form by this idea that we want to strengthen something that is weak or enhance something that's already strong. Now, that's a pretty good way to summarize how God can use our sufferings. Specifically, I think they provide an opportunity for God to strengthen and enhance our understanding of who he is. Maybe you've realized this, or maybe it's just me, but when we suffer, there's kind of two default responses that we can fall into. And one is to minimize it, and the other is to moralize it. So by minimize, here's what I mean. Something's going on in your life, and you say, well, yeah, this is bad, but so-and-so over there, what she's going through, that's really awful, and blah, 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 had this happen, and I just feel so bad for him. Plus, there are starving people all over the world. This really just isn't that big of a deal. I need to adjust my thinking of my own situation because it's not as bad as it seems. Well, we don't see that being God's heart in Scripture. He invites you to cast all your anxieties upon him because he cares for you. And with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find help in time of need. He's the God who upholds all those who are failing and raises up those who are bowed down. Yes, God cares about those other people too. He wants us to lift them up, to petition them to him in prayer. But whatever you're facing, big or small, know that God cares about you. Our other tendency is to moralize suffering. Think of this as kind of a Christian karma, if there is such a thing. If something bad is happening in my life, it must be because I've done something to deserve it. As I covered already, yes, there are times that your sin will result in suffering in your life. So it's not possible to say that's never the case. But we can't say that that's always the case either, because there are plenty of categories in which suffering was unrelated to sin. When adversity strikes, we need to keep that in mind. One of the most famous sufferers in the Bible, Job was all too familiar with the reality that calamity comes regardless of character. In fact, in the first 2 chapters of the book of Job, God himself twice commends Job's integrity, saying, "He is a noble and upright man who fears the Lord and turns away from evil." Now, Satan thought